Good morning friends. This is a very important video on a clarification which is issued by the CBIC yesterday via circular 178/10/2022 dated 3rd of August 2022. This lays to rest a long-standing dispute on what activities would be considered under para 5E of schedule 2 of the CGST Act, that is an obligation for refraining from an act or tolerating an act or tolerating a situation or an obligation to do an act. Let us first understand the definition of service, and thereafter from our understanding of the definition of service, we will apply it to 6 important situations which we will discuss in this video as clarified by circular 178 and a transaction which is not clarified therein. First, a service is an activity which is rendered by one person for another person, and it is for a consideration. So, for a transaction to come within the purview of a service, there has to be an activity. There has to be an act which has to be done or refrained from being done, or an act which has to be tolerated, and there has to be an option at the end of the service provider whether to do the act or not. If there is no option, then it is not an activity. It has to be done by one person for another person, and it should be for a consideration. This consideration for the service should be for the activity which is done itself and not for any other activity or any other act. So, let us now understand with 6 examples. First, something which has not been clarified by this circular 178. Whether MCA charges or ROC charges for increase in the share capital of a company, whether that would be considered to be an activity or a service or not. The ROC portal, while filing the SH forms for increasing the share capital, charges certain fees. However, there is no option before a company to take the services of any other service provider for increment in the share capital. It has to be done by the ROC itself, which is the nodal authority for all corporate related matters. Therefore, this MCA fees would not come within the definition of an activity, and hence the fees which is paid for the MCA charges for increase in the share capital would not be considered to be as a consideration, as there is no nexus to the activity which is rendered. Therefore, in our view, MCA charges for increment in the share capital should not be considered to be as a service and should not be leviable to GST. Second, liquidated damages. Say for example, you have entered into a contract with a builder for providing you construction services, and the builder delays the construction services by 6 months, for which you as a recipient of the construction services charges certain liquidated damages in the form of a penalty. Again, this liquidated damages as per the circular is not for tolerating the act of delay by the builder, but it is actually a penalty for not tolerating the act and for refraining the builder from delaying the project. Therefore, it would not come within the four walls of para 5E of schedule 2 of the CGST Act, and it would not be considered to be as a consideration for supply of goods or services. It would be considered as a non-GST supply or a no supply. Many a times taxpayers ask us a question that for liquidated damages, whether it would be the right approach that you as a service recipient of the original service provides a debit note or a invoice and thereafter you adjust your accounts, or should the contractor who has defaulted and on whom liquidated damages is charged, should the contractor provide you a credit note? In our view, both the processes are correct. However, a credit note under section 34 from the contractor for deficiency of services or supply would be a better option, because that would put to rest any dispute in the future as to whether there was actually a liquidated damages or a deficiency of service or supply or both. Third example is notice period pay or charges recovered from an employee who has not served his bond period. Again, these charges would not be considered to be an act of toleration of an act. It is actually a charges for not tolerating an act of an employee who has left the services without serving a corresponding period, and therefore it would not be considered to be an activity and a services of tolerating an act, refraining from an act, or to do an act. Therefore, it would not be liable to GST, being a non-GST or no supply. Next, cheque cancellation or cheque bouncing charges. Again, these are charges for not tolerating an act of a creditor for getting the cheque bounced. No debtor would want a cheque to be bounced. A debtor would always want a cheque of a creditor to be encashed and the corresponding money to be received by the debtor. However, the penalty for cheque bouncing charges are for refraining the creditor from getting his cheque bounced, and therefore it would be considered to be a no supply for not tolerating the act of non-receipt of payment or cheque bouncing. Now, you would ask a question as to what is to be considered in this para of tolerating or refraining from an act or an obligation to do an act. Services like non-compete agreements, where you enter into a agreement with, say, an employee or a manager for not joining a competitor and paying the person a certain amount of consideration for such non-joining or non-compete fees. Another example, let us take as per this circular, is no-show charges by a hotel or by any other service provider. Would this be considered to be as a service? Answer is in the positive, yes. In case you do a no-show at a hotel, then the no-show charges or retention charges, which is commonly called, would be charged as a part of the supply of hotel accommodation or principal supply services, where these charges would be for getting the room ready, for blocking the room, for reservation of the hotel, etc. And the no-show or retention charges would be considered to partake the nature of the principal supply of hotel charges. Next, is the charges for late payment or interest or penalty for delayed payment. This would be considered to be as included in the value of original supply. So, for example, you supply a computer and the customer pays you after the credit period, and there is a recovery of interest on delayed payment charges from the customer. This interest on delayed payment charges as per section 15 of the CGST Act would be considered to partake the nature of the original supply of computers. You need to charge this interest on delayed payment charges to GST under the same HSN code as the original supply. In our example,